So hi, Paul. Great to be speaking with you today, and I believe you're calling in from Bruges in Belgium. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it's a little bit of history and some wonderful, wonderful local food.
Oh, excellent. Glad to hear it. So Paul Glue is the Hazel Buckland Professor at the Otago Medical School, the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand. And he's a psychiatrist and clinical pharmacologist with extensive experience in the pharmaceutical industry and more recently as an inventor on an extended release ketamine formulation therapy being developed by Douglas Pharmaceutical. So I was hoping we could discuss a few things that are highly relevant in the field of sort of psychiatry and drug development at the moment, Paul. And I've been reading a couple of papers. Uh, just pull these up. I was looking particularly at a couple of papers from Nathan Huneke and colleagues in JAMA Psychiatry recently, where they've done a number of sort of reviews and op-eds on placebo mechanisms in psychiatric trials, and also this concept of expectancy effects, blinding integrity, and their failures in psychiatric trials more generally. So I guess with Lykos's recent sort of failure. With the FDA for their MDMA therapy. There's been a lot of focus on sort of blinding integrity in psychiatric clinical trials. And I'd sort of argue that maybe things like ketamine and other very profoundly sort of psychoactive substances have really just highlighted a more well-known effect in psychiatry, and that is that most psychiatric drugs are, in fact, in some way psychoactive usually, and that therefore they will be functionally unblinded in trials. And this is certainly true for, the stimulants used for ADHD, benzodiazepines used for anxiety, even atypical antipsychotics are often very sedating. So I was just curious to hear your thoughts about this whole concept of blinding integrity and whether, maybe it's received sort of unfavorable attention for a few classes of drugs in recent years.
So look, this is a long-standing problem, and there are some really interesting meta-analyses looking at placebo responses, not just in say ADHD or depression studies, but for conditions such as schizophrenia. And if you look at the magnitude of placebo responses over say the last 30, 35 years, it's also increased.
Yes,
Um,
yeah, I was aware of that in antidepressant trials in particular, which I'm not sure if many people will be familiar with this idea that the placebo response is actually getting stronger in some trials.
yeah. And look, back in my Pfizer days, I worked on a drug called tolterodine that's used for overactive bladder. This is where predominantly women will have periods where they're peeing a lot. They have episodes of urinary incontinence, and again over 30 odd years, massive increases in the placebo response. And really the only way that for say studies of urinary incontinence have managed this is just to get bigger and bigger studies. So if you look at studies from the 1980s versus the 2010s, we've gone from say 50 to 80 people per arm to 250 to 300 per arm, and
Right.
by bumping up numbers of patients, that's one not terribly sophisticated way and very expensive way of um, helping reduce the active placebo difference, or that you can at least get a statistically significant treatment response.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and uh, you know, if you're in the phase two arena where you really want to get a quick read on is my drug working or not, to try and then spend hundreds of millions of dollars putting let's say several hundred people into a phase two program, it's just not feasible. Um,
Yeah.
it and so another way to try and manage this, and we did this in a recent paper that came out in Nature Medicine, was to do what's called uh, a an enrichment design where for the first period of time, and for like ketamine tablets, it can be as short as a week. But for regular antidepressants, it may be, say, 3 to 6 weeks of treatment. And if patients are responders, you then keep them in the trial and randomize them to either to placebo or active. If they're non-responders, you pull them out of the trial. And that seems to be a way of reducing the risk of failure from about 50% down to about 20%. So,
Right.
so getting rid of non-responders is another technique for reducing the risk of exaggerated placebo response. Um, but it's but I noticed in the paper you were quoting from JAMA Psychiatry recently that one of the techniques they mention is to use either biomarkers or really sort of clever statistical designs.
Mhm.
And these are really cool ideas, but nobody has yet been able to reliably show that they work.
Yeah, I was about to say that anyone who's familiar with the history of biomarkers in psychiatry specifically will be aware it's a bit of a graveyard, not through lack of sort of effort or capital expenditure. Um, do you think there are other sort of in oncology, for example, people have really used sort of biomarkers to develop things like basket trials and umbrella trials and really think
Yeah.
about this more sort of precision trial design. I know Anthony Rogers at the George Institute in Sydney is really interested in exploring the idea of platform trials in psychiatry. Obviously, they have very large setup costs. Are there other sort of interesting trial designs that you think from other areas of medicine that might be suitable for psychiatry with some adaptation?
Let's say it's challenging. That again with it, one of the greatest difficulties we have is that we use um, a diagnostic system such as ICD-11 or DSM-5, which essentially cluster together people on the basis of either self-reported symptoms or clinical features, and
Yeah.
as a sort of practical way of trying, as a shorthand of saying, this person is sad or anxious or psychotic, it's fine. But I suspect that what we're doing is we're clustering together a very heterogeneous group of people, and what Anthony's talking about, and for things like oncology trials where you can get let's say soluble biomarkers that might be able to sort of
Mm.
more coherently sort of cluster together people. It's a there I think you've got a better chance for these umbrella trials working, whereas I think putting together 300 to 600 patients with who might all be anxious or unhappy or psychotic, you probably still have too much heterogeneity to realistically be able to lump people together. And then one other problem you've got is you've got to then assume that FDA or EMA are going to accept evolutionary study design. That is it reasonable to put all these people together who may where there may be a lot of diagnostic or clinical heterogeneity, and would you accept any sort of uh, treatment outcomes in that context? And I just don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, this is another area that's another thing that's sort of unique to psychiatry, it seems, compared to other areas like oncology, where we have had increasingly sort of precise biomarkers and things that are
Yeah.
quantitative. You have this unique interplay between heterogeneity of the patient population you're seeking to treat because of sort of poor or limited diagnostic tools like the DSM. But you also have, limitations of the various validated endpoints that are used, and that's pretty well accepted at this point, I think. And then regulatory tolerance for change to any of these things and what that might be, what that might mean. So that there's been a few sort of recent papers looking at this idea of sort of biotyping depressive disorders, at least using sort of non-invasive imaging tools and profiles or signatures from those tools. One of the more interesting developments I saw very recently, speaking with Ahmet Etkin of Alto Neuroscience, is that they presented data at the Society of Biological Psychiatry annual meeting in Toronto recently, showing a sort of prospectively identified and very well replicated EEG-based biomarker for the placebo response in MDD. Do you think, obviously all of this is very exciting and it wouldn't be the first time that a sort of biomarker has been sort of nominated in psychiatry, but do you think this will be a pretty groundbreaking sort of finding that will ultimately be accepted by regulatory agencies, or is it another sort of incremental step?
Uh, Look, I think the first step would be to replicate it.
Yeah.
Um, that that's one of the major gaps that we have, where people will have a great idea, and again, you've got some really bright people working on this, and just trying to be able to show that there's some sort of consistency in terms of what you're looking for, or what this effect can be reliably shown, and that would be a game changer if it's possible.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I'm certainly hoping that Alto are successful here because yeah, anything that can sort of reduce those attrition rates in phase two trials and beyond could lead to a lot of otherwise probably very good drugs being shelved for reasons that may not be related to their sort of therapeutic potential.
so I was a big fan of Tom Insell's concept of RDocs. So this is a
Yep.
thing that brought out, gosh, it'll be about 15 years ago now, where they were looking at a range of domains. So they moved away completely from diagnostic criteria, and looked at, I guess, symptom domains, and anhedonia seemed to be one of the more
Mm,
promising ones. And there've just been a couple of quite sizable phase three trials with, I think, NK1 antagonists, that have failed abjectly, where they were using anhedonia as the key symptom to be treated, rather than sort of looking at diagnosis per se. So
mm,
I think our docs are struggling a bit with this as well.
mm.
I guess another thing, and this is looking at the problems that Lycos had with their recent interactions with the FDA evaluation committee. The idea that the impact of the drug effect itself, the side effects that people report, are so profound that it really makes assessment of any clinical improvement incredibly difficult.
Right.
Uh, and I think Lycos probably went in, if I can use the term, that they were a bit cocky. I think they had the sense that we've got 6, 7 very consistent studies in patients with PTSD. We've shown a positive drug effect. It seems to be a durable effect. And then the advisory committee really rained on their parade massively.
Mm,
And I guess they late phase work in a much more um, uh, I guess, rigorous way of managing problems of unblinding, and also having but perhaps blinded raters, so that
right.
uh, that would perhaps deal with some of the issues. But I think like I certainly have quite a big job to do to get their program over accepted by FDA.
Mm. Yeah. Lykos's program is a little unusual by the standards of sort of traditional psychiatric drug development for a number of reasons. Um, and obviously, yeah, the AdCom and the FDA decision received a lot of attention in the media. Do you think groups like Compass, who are expecting sort of top line results for their primary endpoints to be reported, I think at the end of June, do you think groups who have taken maybe a more traditional pharmaceutical development approach to these compounds that are also subject to issues of blinding integrity, do you think they'll face the same challenges? Is this a more unique sort of Lykos issue? Is it a bigger regulatory problem, or is it just sort of undue attention in an area that exists for many psychiatric drugs?
So I had a sense that the phase two program that from Compass, this is the Guy Goodwin article in the New England Journal a couple of years ago, was put together in a much more traditional way,
Mm,
and whether this is going to avoid a lot of the criticism that the advisory committee um, came up with Lycos. I don't have a sense yet. So I'm sort of really interested in seeing what the phase three results look like.
yeah.
Um, there's also that sort of sticky problem of FDA are there to approve drugs and not psychotherapy, and so
Yeah.
whether there's this whole sort of cursed question of um, how important is the psychotherapy component, and how much input would FDA, who historically have had very little say on this area, but be able to advise in terms of what the data sheet is eventually going to look like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another very sort of thorny issue that I haven't seen too much commentary on, apart from very semantic approaches to what you actually call the psychotherapy, and how evolved it is, and how standardized it is. I guess just one last question, because it's something I saw very recently, is Michelle Longmire, who's a Stanford clinician who's launched a startup called Medable, which is aiming to use sort of machine learning tools, a lot of which already exist. These are sort of proven technologies with LLMs, to do things like translate, various regulatory documents into different languages if you're running trials around different parts of the world. Essentially to remove some of the white space between different sections of the very lengthy clinical trial process, with the ultimate aim to reduce costs and timelines. And I think we can all agree that the costs and time to complete a trial, even from phase one, are very long, and probably much longer than they need to be in many cases. But do you have any thoughts on how well these sorts of machine learning tools will be accepted by regulatory agencies when you're seeking to really change the way we've run trials for a very long time?
So look, it's not an area they've had any major exposure. I think it's from an abstract perspective, if this can improve acceptability, and especially across different regulatory agencies, it would be absolutely wonderful.
Mhm.
How the agencies are going to read this. Just over the last 18 months, I've had meetings with FDA and EMA over the extended release ketamine tablets, and what I'd assumed would be hopefully a very homogenous response was not at all like that. That we had same issues coming up and being synthesized in very different ways by these different agencies. So um, it's there does still seem to be a very individual response to the sorts of development or clinical safety questions that these agencies have. So
Yeah, I guess we'll wait and see, like a lot of these questions.
yeah, Xylo is still going to have to have their moments of doubt and pain and excitement.
Yeah.
As you start to roll out your programs.
Yep. Yeah, that's very certainly true, I'm sure. All right. Well, thanks so much for your time, Paul. I don't want to take too much more time from your vacation, but really appreciate you jumping on for a chat, and hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Belgium.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Sam.